Honestly, I used to do like midterms like on the bus, like just chilling, and I'd pull out and do midterms. And it was a great experience because I hate studying. So this video, I'm basically going to describe how I take notes for classes and what exactly do I do for each of the classes that I take notes. Now, this might not help a lot of you. Most people have their own study methods and it works for them. But usually, most of the cases actually, there are some courses where their particular study method doesn't work. So in this video, I'm basically going to give the tips that I have used to study for specific classes and how I take notes for those specific classes and what exactly do I do and how I structure it. Now, these methods have worked for me and they might not actually work for you. However, you might end up being able to get some tips here and there along the way throughout the video, and so I would recommend watching the whole video. Now, if you don't want to watch the whole video, and that's totally fine, a lot of people are in a rush nowadays, I'm going to include a quick structure of everything that I'm going to include in the video because who doesn't like an organized video? So I'm going to start off by talking about what devices I use when I study, and I know this might sound weird, like what devices? Of course, you just take notes on paper. Well, actually, I made a video about the iPad Pro and how I take notes on my iPad Pro that I will link above right here. I will include a quick picture of the video right here as well. Now, I also use my laptop and I also use my phone when I take notes, and I will explain why later on. And then the second part of the video will discuss the practice-based framework. So I also made a video about the practice-based framework and how that actually helped me perform really well in my stats class, as well as in my organic chemistry class. And then finally, I will discuss the read and recite review framework. So the practice-based framework works for courses where there's a lot of, calculations like statistics, calculus, organic chemistry, other chemistry courses. And then the read, recite, review framework works for courses where there's a lot of memorization, like psychology, biology, anatomy, kinesiology, health, any courses where you're basically memorizing facts, not verbatim, but you're memorizing a lot of facts, then the read, recite, and review framework will work for it. Now, I mainly only use these two categories because 99% of courses fall under them, so there's really no point into splitting my lectures and splitting my learning into each different class because that's really, it gets complicated at that point. So I basically just organize everything into these two simple categories. Alright, so what devices do I use? So let's split up organizing notes into two different categories first. So there's usually the typers, then there's the writers. Wow, that rhymed. So the typers, pretty self-explanatory. Those are the people that type up all their notes by hand, type everything up. Then the writers are the people that write everything down on a notebook. Now, like I said before in my iPad video, the writers actually have the benefit that there's better retention. There's a variety of research that actually shows this. Now, the typers have the benefit where they could search any document they want in a moment's notice on their laptop and it'll come up really, really quickly. Now, there's actually an article by a researcher named Dr. Mueller. She is a psychologist at Princeton University, and she has an article titled, "The Pen is Mightier Than the Keyboard." And in this article, they talk about the comparisons between people that type up their notes and people that write their notes. And they basically give a quick overview of how effective one note-taking method is over another. Now, it's really famous nowadays for people to type everything up because you could usually type faster than you could write. But the issue with that is that a lot of people write verbatim. So essentially, whatever the lecturer is saying, whatever the professor is saying, they'll write down everything without actively listening to what the professor is saying and, decoding their information and writing it down in their own words. So in this research article, they found that we show that whereas taking more notes can be beneficial, laptop note takers' tendency to transcribe lectures verbatim rather than processing information and reframing it in their own words is detrimental to their learning. And then they actually ended up finding that people who took notes on their laptop wrote on average 1.5 times as much as people that wrote notes by hand. So this goes to show that people that write notes on the computer, yes, it's beneficial in that you write everything down, but later on they did a test to compare these two note-taking methods to see which one was more effective in retaining all this information for helping students do better in their classes and better in their assessments. And they found, however, when students were allowed to review their notes for 10 minutes, so the students that were allowed to review their notes, they're discussing the students that typed everything up, so like I said, the typers and the writers. In advance of the test, those who took longhand notes performed better on both factual and conceptual questions. Now, factual questions is like, who is the Prime Minister of Canada? Well, obviously that's Justin Trudeau. I don't know if you're watching this in America, you probably don't even know who the Prime Minister of Canada is. Now, a conceptual question would probably be like, I don't know, like, when would you add sodium chloride to this reaction? I don't know, that's kind of like the best one I could come up with right now. There's probably better, but something where you have to use your current information and then apply it. Now, there's also another benefit to writers in that they can kind of create the notes however they want. So if I were to open my iPad right now, and I were to go to open Notability, I were to open up Notability, and then I come up to one of my lectures. Let's say I were to go to a stats lecture, and I open, I don't know, let's go with hypothesis testing. So I could kind of create whatever I want. I could create any circles, I could make any squares that I want, I could make things very neatly written. And if I actually go to some of my lectures, let's go to the beginning. Let's go to outliers. Let's see if I was neat here. Okay, clearly I was not neat here. Let's go to conditional probability. Let's see. Okay, so over here you can see that I tried to make one of those Venn diagrams where you have stuff in the middle. So you can see I made a bit of a mistake, and I'm sure if I was more meticulous, I probably could have. Oopsies. I'm sure if I was more meticulous, I probably could have erased those extra edges, but you get the point that I'm trying to say, in that you can be very neat when you're writing and you have more flexibility, and that you could create whatever diagrams you want. And that's basically kind of why they're saying, Dr. Mueller is probably saying that the people that write is more effective because everything they do is in their own words. So what she's trying to say is just make sure you actively listen to the lecture and you transcribe notes in your own words and not just verbatim what the lecturer is saying. And so now we'll get into the practice-based framework. So essentially, like I said earlier, the practice-based framework will work for any courses where there's a lot of calculation, like math, stats, organic chemistry, any class at all. So ideally, we want to read our lectures beforehand, but I know we're all very busy and we don't end up doing that. We might start off in the semester, reading everything beforehand on top of our game, but then we end up declining later on. And I always fall into this all the time. I try to get on top of my game in the beginning of the semester, but then things end up declining and they don't end up working out. So now I'm going to show you guys exactly how I take notes for two examples, which is organic chemistry and statistics. So if I were to open up my Orgo notes from last year, and I open up any lecture slides. So this is an example of lecture slides that our professor supplied us. And you can see it has a lot of notes. But I would go through each of the lectures in class, and I would also write down by listening to what the lecturer is saying and write any extra things. So if I were to go down here, I would look up here. I would say, okay, here clearly we have the periodic table. We have the electronegativity numbers. Fluorine is the highest at 4.0. And now I can see, so this question is asking in the relative acid strength. So now I know that hydrofluoric acid is probably the strongest one out of all of these because it has most stable conjugate base. So by myself writing all this stuff down, it helps me remember it. So since it's the strongest acid, it has the highest Ka and the lowest pKa. So now I try to think to myself, okay, so now I know that if there's a strong acid, we have to have high Ka and low pKa. Now I probably could have figured this out if I went through all my notes. However, me writing this down helps me remember it better because I remember myself in that situation writing down all this notes. When I'm in an assessment or I'm in an exam, I start to think, and when I try to remember things, I remember myself in class, answering a question or writing something down, and that's what helps me remember. I have no idea what it's called, maybe like geographical memory, no idea at all, but it helps me remember things later on and it helps me retain the information much longer. Now, for classes like these where you have, a lot of questions that you're doing, a lot of calculations, I would recommend that you do like a cheat sheet. So usually in like any class that has all these calculations, it's possible to make a cheat sheet. So for Organic Chemistry 1, which was this class, I'll show you what I did for Organic Chemistry 2 as well. I had a cheat sheet, and what I would do was take screenshots of the main concept, the main things I needed to know. So here was, for example, in the beginning of the course, we learned naming. So I wrote down all the naming priorities. Here I have the strongest to weakest acid. I would have diastereomers, enantiomers, all the stereochemical isomers. Then I would also have, EZ, E2, E1, different chemical reactions that we learned. But at the end of the day, using the cheat sheet was way more efficient because I wouldn't have to go through all of my notes and try to find certain things. I could just refer to this cheat sheet when I wanted a quick answer, when I was doing all the practice. And that brings me to my second point, which is practice. Now you could also see for organic chemistry, I had a lot of practice tests that I did. So these are examples of practice tests that I would do where I put myself in the actual situation, put my phone away, turn it off, and I would set up a timer and I would start the exam. Now I wouldn't give myself time to review because on the actual exam, I'll probably have time to review, but by not giving myself time to review now, I will essentially make myself put in a difficult position right now. And I talk about that a lot in my video where I talk about, the practice-based framework and how I did well in my stats class. I talk about that you need to challenge yourself. So by myself not giving myself time to review, that helps me actually perform better on test day. If I open up a final exam, let's open up 2014. So we go through the final exam and you can see I answer them exactly on the paper. And what I usually do is I put a dash, so you can see this dash right here. I put a dash next to the question that I'm 90% sure of, 80% sure of. Maybe I'm I want to review after, but I don't have time to review it because I told you I don't review on these things because it helps you perform better on test day. These green is what I ended up getting correct and wrong when I went to go, re-look at my stuff and remark it. And that's because you have to do a lot of practice when it comes to these courses. Now, a lot of people think that just going to class, writing all your notes down, transcribing the notes and rereading them, it's I'm good to go. But with classes where there's a lot of practice questions, honestly, I usually don't even go through my notes again. What I usually do after lecture, like I said, I literally go, like, I look at the examples and I do the examples without looking at my notes. Then I go back to the notes just to fill in the gaps. Now, I do the same thing for my stats class as well that I had last year. So this class was a bit different where we weren't given slides, we weren't giving notes. So essentially what I had to do was write everything down that the lecturer was saying. So you can see I have a lot of notes, and that's because by writing down all this stuff, of course, I didn't write down every single word he said. You can imagine, like, these lectures were very, very long. Like this was probably a hard lecture. But if I go to let's go to binomial. So right, this one, it wasn't too filled with words. It was more notation. So there was things that I wrote down. I tried to write the minimal amount of things down that would help me understand something. And then once I finished all of this and I finished writing everything down, and I always tried to make it color coded because I wanted to try to make things stand out to me. When I went back to them, I would be able to see it and visualize it in my head. I'm a very visual person. When it comes to the exams, the way I remember calculations and the you know, the specific reactions is I remember the color that I made when I was writing on my iPad. So for example, if I was trying to remember a certain notation, I probably would remember orange and blue, and then I would be able to, you know, figure out exactly where that was on my page, and then that's how I would answer the question when it came to my assessment. Once we finish that, let's go to my stats assessment. So here we have stat 202 assignments, and you can see that I have my assignments and my clicker test. So before every single midterm, I would download all the clicker questions that my professor would do, and I would basically organize them into one big document. So you can see clicker test for midterm 1. So essentially I would put them, and then I would try to answer every single one of them by myself without going to my notes. Keep in mind, I didn't study yet for this midterm. I'm kind of just going through these questions to figure out where, you know, my gaps lie, like I said. So then I answered these questions, and then for a second time around, I would write down exactly what I got correct and what I got wrong. But essentially I would go through the clicker questions again. It helps you perform better on the exam because you're already putting yourself in a situation where you have to actively recall these questions. So that's essentially what I do for the practice-based framework. And again, like I told you, it's always good to do practice tests and go back and fill in the gap. Personally, I didn't study that much for these classes. I mainly just did questions. That might change for you. Like I said earlier, this method might not work for everyone, but I found that it was very effective for me. Now we're going to talk about the read, recite, and review framework. Now for the read, recite, and review framework, it essentially works for any course where there's memorization in. Like even the least bit of memorization, this framework will work for it. I personally will use it in biology and in psychology, and I'll show you exactly how I use it. So I open the iCloud files up by itself, and I open it, and it opens automatically in PowerPoint. And the reason why I like doing this is because this PowerPoint account is connected to my laptop's PowerPoint account. So any changes I make on the PowerPoint right here, so if I were to draw something, any changes I make right here will also be updated on my iCloud Drive. So this is kind of the main reason why I don't use Notability. So if I were to go to my lectures from last semester where I actually had more notes that I took on them, let's just go back. You know, let's open the TCA cycle, okay? So you guys can see on this lecture, I took notes right then and there. So this is actually the professor's notes, but as you see, you can see my writing right here, and I can actually delete anything that I wrote. So I like writing it on the slide exactly, just like I said earlier, because it helps me memorize and it helps me understand the information better. But we're not done here, and a lot of people kind of just finish writing their notes on their slides and they'll review it for the exam. But personally, what I like to do is take this one step further and actually input all the information into Anki. So essentially, Anki is like a flashcard system. And in Anki, what I'll usually do is I'll start making a new note. And here's where I make a new note. So essentially, I'll open up the PowerPoint that I just did. So we had what, week 4 content? That's what it was called. So we'll open up week 4 content. And then what I'll do is I'll go through each of the lectures and I'll see, okay, see, I have notes. So here I see other SNPs, and I'll make a screenshot of it, and then I'll make flashcards for each one of my courses. And that's essentially how I'll study for them. And that helps a lot because it helps you retain all of the information for a longer period of time. And this is essentially all I do for the read, recite, and review courses because it helps you memorize information for a longer period of time. Not only that, but it also helps you continuously see the information on multiple different occasions, helping you keep it in your memory and helping you eventually end up performing better on test day. And now that we've come to the end of our video, thank you guys so much for watching. There's probably not a lot of you watching to the end of this video because I know it was probably a bit boring, but if you did enjoy it, even in the slightest, smash that like button. Subscribe, it helps me out so much. Thank you guys so much for watching my videos. I'll see you guys on the next one. Cheers.